that whole thing. Okay, let's start over. Welcome to Brain Injury Basics. Now that we have the slides. Again, my goal for this class is to set the stage and the foundation for further learning. It's going to be broken up into 6 different parts. This is the first part. And I mentioned this earlier, but once you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. I've never seen the same brain injury twice. And the reason I say that is first of all, don't compare yourselves to others' progress. We will have family members in here that have had a similar brain injury and their loved one is not making as fast progress, as much progress, even though they're along the same timeline from injury to rehab. So don't compare yourselves, don't compare loved ones, just stay focused on the goal. A brain injury, in my mind, the way I see a brain injury is once the brain injury has occurred, you're taking a brain that now wants to be a couch potato because it takes way too much resources and way too much energy to be able to perform like it once did before. So the goal with brain injury rehabilitation is to take that couch potato brain and start to slowly train it for a 5K. And once you've been able to build some endurance in the system, you want to take that 5K brain because you've gone to a next level and you want to jump to a 10K with new rehab, with new protocols, with new challenges. From the 10K, you want to try to train that brain for a half marathon, and then a full marathon, and then an ultra marathon, and then a 100 miler. And the reason I say that is when I'm working with a brain injury patient, it's a journey. It's a long journey, and you don't necessarily get to see a huge change with just a little bit of physical stimulation, physical exercise, physical rehabilitation. So my perspective is we're in it for the long haul. Whether you're working with me or with someone else, if you have that mentality and mindset and you celebrate those small wins that you start to see, then you're just going to know that good things are going to come. And it's really hard to do that, but I just want to say 2 things about this. Do not compare yourselves or loved ones to others' brain injuries because every brain injury is different, even if it's very similar anatomically, because everyone's different. And then when you're doing neurorehabilitation, you have to have that, not to say everything's going to be great, rainbows and butterflies, but that positive mental attitude with your eyes on the prize, knowing that this is a journey and knowing that you're in it for the long haul. And this every single day that you're working or your loved one is working, you're training for that next big race, right? You're going from a couch potato brain because it doesn't have the ability, the energy to get off the couch, and you're training for the 5K, the 10K, the half marathon, ultra, 100 miler. So I just wanted to say that too. And thank you again for whoever spoke up. I owe you big time about my slides. So 2 non-negotiables of brain injury. We just talked about this too, but sleep and nutrition. When you do physical exercise, physical stimulation, neurorehabilitation sets the stage in the nervous system for change. But the nervous system does not change unless it gets deep rest and deep sleep. Neuroplasticity occurs during this. So sleep is one of the most important things when you're recovering from a brain injury. And when I say sleep, I don't mean isolation. I had, this was a couple of years ago when I first started working in this space, an NFL player got in contact with me. I don't work with a lot of NFL players, but it was just a couple of phone calls. He had a pretty severe concussion 3 weeks prior to our conversation. And up until that point, he was still, as prescribed by the athletic trainer of the NFL team, sitting in a dark room, not doing anything, not getting any exercise. And his injury and his symptoms slowly started to change from brain fog, mental fatigue, physical fatigue to just straight up depression. So I don't mean isolation in any sense when I say sleep, but if you're not on a good sleep schedule, if you don't have good sleep hygiene, if you're taking stimulants or medications that are going to alter your sleep patterns, and that has to be addressed. And this is going to be the second workshop. Another very, very important non-negotiable in brain injury is nutrition. So this is sometimes a hard conversation to have for people. In the South, in the US, Chick-fil-A, if you tell someone they can't have their Chick-fil-A, you've almost like brought up a whole other topics of like politics and religion. So it's really important that we feed the nervous system what it needs. And you have to create an internal environment that is going to reduce the ability for constant neuroinflammation, constant oxidative stress to occur. And you do that by feeding your body the right foods. Again, this is a whole other topic, but I just wanted to mention this because if you're trying to change the brain for the better, especially in a brain injury, and you're not feeding yourself the right things, then it's going to be difficult to create neuroplasticity in those pathways. Another reason for this is there is evidence that shows in animal studies that as soon as 6 hours after a brain injury, there are disruptions to the barrier systems. Those barrier systems, we've got a couple of barrier systems. We have our skin barrier, lung barrier, brain barrier, and gut barrier. Two that have been studied that I've read upon are the gut lining. So if you haven't heard me describe this before, a barrier system. So let's say it's finally spring. We've gone through winter, a harsh winter in Canada. It's finally spring. It's a beautiful day outside. There's a light breeze. We're sitting on our back porch because we have a screened in back porch. So we're getting this wonderful breeze, but all of a sudden someone cuts a hole in the screened in porch and you've got a mosquito problem in your backyard, and all these mosquitoes start flying in and causing disruption in your nice woosah moment on your back porch, on your back screened in porch. That's what disruption of the barrier system is in my mind. These barrier systems are set up to protect us. They're set up to allow good things in our body, in our digestive system, good things into our brain, and keep the bad things out. In a brain injury, disruption can occur within 6 hours after a brain injury within our gut system, our gut lining, and our blood-brain barrier. So the only way that I understand to help reestablish the barrier systems is through proper nutrition, reducing oxidative stress and inflammation, but also doing things like vagus nerve stimulation and trying to shift the conversation in your nervous system. So that's all going to be a second workshop, but I just want to talk about those two, because if sleep's not on your radar, if nutrition's not on your radar, then it really should be. Okay, now diving into the deeper part of this workshop. So the way I think of the brain, especially with a brain injury, I think of our nervous system as a home. And the reason I say that is when you're building a home, you first have to have a solid foundation. Without a solid foundation, you could potentially put the walls up, you could put the framework up, you could put the walls up, you could put the roof up, but as soon as people start walking around in the house, that foundation might start to crack, and it's going to change the structure of that house. And it's no longer going to be a house that's going to be livable in. So the way that you build a house is very similar to the way that our nervous system is developed. Our nervous system, through our neurotypical neurodevelopment, it is created from the bottom up and from the back to the front. So the first area that really develops is the neuraxis. We've got our spinal cord, our brainstem, and then you start to see these outpouchings from there that soon become our brain. But if there's not good bottom up or foundation in the nervous system, then it's going to be difficult to create positive changes to the bigger parts of the brain. Now, this is what I really want to say about this, is that this is where our therapy and the way that I perceive brain injury rehabilitation is a little bit different, because I think if you look at normal neurodevelopment, things have to occur in a sequential chronological order for the brain to be able to be its best self. And some of those things are establishment of the brainstem mechanisms, reflexes within the brainstem, Then we have to slowly start to develop our sensory systems. And then from all of that, once all that's developed, then the part of the brain that really makes us human and who we are becomes developed. So let me just show you this real quick. This is a crack in the foundation. The foundation for me is the most primitive area of the brain. It's the brain stem, it's the spinal cord. So in a brain injury, in a closed head injury, there can be bad things that happen to neurons. You can have tensional forces, so stretching of neurons. You can have rotational or twisting forces of neurons. So this is really looking at the cellular level. And then you can have shearing forces of the neuron. So the reason I'm talking about foundation is because I think when we think about brain injury, we think a lot about the brain, which would make sense. But when a brain injury occurs inside the skull, the big part of the brain, the 3-pound object, sits on top of our small little brain stem. So you've got this huge brain sitting on top of this brain stem. And if there is shearing occurring or torsional changes to the brain, so if the brain gets twisted up, if it gets bruised up, you're going to have brain injury. But there are long neurons that connect the bridge, the brainstem, to the brain and the body that become impacted. So the brainstem has to be an area that is looked at in concussion rehabilitation and in brain rehabilitation. So what happens in a brain injury is all of a sudden your nervous system, your healthy house, it gets rocked, right? The whole house gets rocked. And things change, but that's okay, because we know based on the principles of neuroplasticity that even though there might be a negative occurrence in the nervous system, the brain can change. And I truly believe this because I've seen it. I've seen some magical things happen when people start to do the right types of therapies for themselves when they've suffered from a stroke or from a brain injury or from a spinal cord injury. The question always is what does the brain need? What do we have to feed the brain in order for the brain to heal? But we know that the brain can change. It can reroute pathways. You can create new parts of the nervous system that talk to other areas to wake up the injured parts. But for me, it always starts with the foundation. So when a brain injury occurs, it creates a crack in the foundation of the nervous system. That foundation for me is the brainstem. And this is going to be the third workshop of the brain injury basics course. I'm going to shed a little light on this, but there's a lot to talk about when you're talking about neurorehabilitation of the brainstem. The brainstem is so important because the brainstem is the most primitive part of our nervous system. It is an area that's responsible, that helps pave the path for further brain development. And if there is inflammation or injury in the brainstem, and if the brainstem is not working the way that it should, it's going to be hard to allocate other resources to other areas of the brain because the brainstem is not working the way that it should. And the way to think about that is a healthy nervous system, it can shift between more of a rest, digest, parasympathetic state, or it can shift to fight or flight state. In my work in brain injury, what I've noticed is that the nervous system kind of gets stuck. It almost starts to create neuroplasticity in the fight or flight sympathetic pathways. And that can happen, right? Because based on neuroplasticity is not just a hard neuron changing, it's neurochemical signaling. So neurochemicals can start to signal and get stuck on this mouse wheel of sympathetic activity, of fight or flight activity. The problem with that is that if you're stuck in a fight or flight situation, even though you may not feel like it, but if there are symptomatic signs that tell us that the nervous system is not as relaxed as it could be, then that needs to be addressed. Because what happens is when your nervous system shifts from a rest and digest state to a fight or flight state, you're now allocating all resources that are responsible for good interoceptive work in the system, which means good internal work, to important areas like your heart, your lungs, your digestion, your spleen, your pancreas, all that starts to shift. All those resources start to shift, and they're allocated out towards our peripheral system. So more like our skeletal muscle. So when you have that shift, and you shift into fight or flight, and you're stuck in fight or flight, that could start to look like chronic pain in the muscles, right? Joint pain, things like that. It could also look like poor digestion, changes in breathing patterns, changes in immune function. So if the brainstem has not been addressed in a patient who walks into the office, or someone who's working on themselves with a brain injury, that's where I start. And some of the key neurorehabilitation strategies in brainstem rehabilitation is working on breath work. It's some of this stuff is going to be boring, but it's so important because this is the foundation. I want everyone to start thinking about the brainstem as our foundation for further brain healing. If the brainstem has not been given the love that it needs after a brain injury, it might be appropriate to go back and look at how good a person's breathing. Are they doing more? Are they doing a higher respiratory rate than the average person? Are they breathing with their rib cages and not their diaphragm? That's really important to look at because you have to oxygenate the system properly so that you can build neuroplasticity. But also doing conscious breath work, if a patient's able to, and I know not all patients are going to be able to do this, but doing conscious breath work will completely shift the conversation that's happening in the nervous system. And it can switch you from a fight or flight state to more of a parasympathetic state. And if you do that repetitive over time, it follows the principles of neuroplasticity. If you start to use conscious breath work, you'll start to, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you use it, you'll improve it. And then repetition is going to create and establish those pathways so that it becomes less of a conscious effort and more of a subconscious effort. So breath work is where I start. And again, I'll go into a whole workshop on these key neurorehabilitation strategies. Sorry, I gotta let some people in. And it all starts with breath work for me. And so we're going to do that today. We're going to do a very short thing on breath work. And I know it might sound a little bit silly. It might sound a little bit boring, but it's so important in order to help create that foundation in the nervous system that's been lost. Outside of breath work, let me go back. Trigeminal nerve stimulation. The research I've read on trigeminal nerve stimulation, this is your fifth cranial nerve, Roman numeral 5. I heard a joke about Roman numerals. Anyways, your fifth cranial nerve, it's a huge cranial nerve. It provides sensation to the face, and it also helps innervate the muscles of mastication. So it helps us chew, which chewing our food is really important. But stimulation of the cranial nerve with some simple stuff, something as simple as a TENS unit, can help improve cerebral blood flow in the brain after a brain injury. So I'll go into specifics on that on the next workshop. I posted a lot about the vagus nerve. The more I read about vagus nerve stimulation, my question is always like, what can stimulation to the vagus nerve not do? And I know it might not be for everybody, but vagal nerve stimulation is proving to be one of the most important things to create a solid foundation in the nervous system. So the vagus nerve can be stimulated through exercises like breath work, singing in the shower, cold exposure. And then from a more like medical perspective, you could do things like transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation, which in and of itself is a newer application in neurorehabilitation. When I was working in the hospital, this was like 10 years ago. That's crazy. I'm getting old. I was working on a post neurosurgery floor, and people were getting implantable vagal nerve stimulators, which are very important if it's appropriate. But I was thinking, like, is there a way to do this? And I thought in my head, I never said this out loud, and not have to get surgery, because with surgery, you run the risk of medical device failure, infection, readmittance into the hospital, things like that. And there's tons of great devices out there now that are showing that you can stimulate the vagus nerve transcutaneously and have a similar impact on the nervous system. And then one that might be a little bit out of left field for some people, but primitive reflex reintegration exercises. So if you're not familiar with primitive reflexes, and again, I'll go into more detail when I do this workshop, primitive reflexes are a set of survival reflexes that are hosted in our brainstem. They live in our brainstem, and they help us throughout our first year of life. And they're really important for normal neurodevelopment. As we engage in our environment in the first year of life, these primitive reflexes, they start to go into hibernation. So don't think about, sometimes people say the primitive reflexes go away. I don't think they ever go away. I think what happens is your nervous system starts to develop to a point where you don't see those primitive reflexes anymore, but they just go into hibernation. One thing that can pull them out of hibernation is chronic exposure to stress, chronic or constant inflammatory responses happening in the body, or a brain injury. A brain injury can pull these primitive reflexes out of hibernation, and these primitive reflexes now are starting to express themselves on like a physical exam. And when those primitive reflexes are present, it's hard for the other parts of the nervous system to work the way that they should. Because in normal neurotypical development, as we go through our first year of life and we engage in the environment, those primitive reflexes go into hibernation and allow the occipital lobe to develop more, the auditory cortex to develop more, the sensory cortex to develop more, and then the prefrontal cortex, the area that makes you who you are, really develop. So primitive reflexes are an area that really need to be focused on in brain injury rehabilitation. And sometimes what I've seen is if a patient has a brain injury and they physically can't do something, then they're physically, put to go do that over and over and over again. But they could potentially do that exercise better if you take 3 steps back and focus on primitive reflex work. Best example I can give you of this is if you've never read Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, he talks about stroke rehabilitation. So, this is a guy who worked in the conventional medical scene for a long time, but then started to have questions about neuroplasticity and how the brain can heal. And what he found was that people who suffer from strokes, their walking was getting better by doing things like crawling, right? And that makes sense from a neurodevelopment standpoint. If you can't crawl good, you may not be able to walk good. So in our office, we'll look at gait and we'll look at walking, but we won't make you walk unless you can actually crawl good. So we'll get on the floor and we'll start crawling, and we'll do things with the crawl to help stimulate certain areas of the brain to put those primitive reflexes back into hibernation. Okay, so just on the topic of breathing, I've posted something similar to this on my Brain Chat Facebook page, but shallow breathing, it's a very common complication after head injury. And with shallow breathing, you're not engaging your diaphragm. This can cause partial filling up of the lungs. It alters the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then all of a sudden, you're not oxygenating your system well. If this is not something that's addressed in a patient who is consciously moving around and walking and talking after a brain injury, it's something that needs to be addressed. Because if you can take conscious control of your breaths, you can better oxygenate your system and rid yourself of CO2, which could be slowing down your brain's ability to create neuroplasticity. This is a breathing tool that I learned from Dr. Andrew Huberman on the Huberman Lab podcast. He talked about the physiological sigh. It's something that we do reflexively and inherently, sometimes in times of stress or when we're sleeping at night. But this is a good way to start to shift the nervous system from more of a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic state. And the reason for that is when you do a long nasal inhale, and a nasal inhale is recommended because you're going to oxygenate your system better. There's more nitric oxide available through a nasal inhale than an oral inhale, but a long nasal inhale followed by a short nasal inhale, and then a long exhale with a sigh, and doing that over and over again, maybe for like a minute or as we'll talk about later, like up to 10 minutes if possible. But doing an activity like this is going to shift your nervous system from a sympathetic activity to a parasympathetic activity. on his lab, on his podcast, he talks about doing this in times of stress to try to pull your nervous system away from stress. So it's almost like kind of like a biohack, but there really is no biohacking your way out of a brain injury. I just wanted people to see this because it's another important thing to know if you're trying to do some conscious controlled breathing. So on the topic of vagus nerve stimulation, improving the parasympathetics, there's so many potentials with vagus nerve stimulation. Again, my question is what can vagus nerve stimulation not do? It's not really what can it do, but there's research that shows, and this is all proven in the research, improve parasympathetic activity, shift you from sympathetic to parasympathetic state, improve your heart rate variability. The higher your heart rate variability is, the better your vagus nerve is functioning. Improve barrier integrity. I mentioned this earlier. It can improve your GI motility. So in a brain injury, what happens is typically patients become constipated. And it's not because they're deficient in a stool stimulant or a stool softener. It's because what happens is the brain stops telling the gut to activate what are called migrating motor complexes. It slows down communication between brain, gut, and from gut to those migrating motor complexes. So it's almost like there's a stall in motor activity in your digestive tract and you become constipated. So improving vagal tone can help with constipation and improve your gastrointestinal motility. And obviously it can help reduce stress and anxiety. But again, what can it not do? I don't know, there's so many things. So that's step one. So if you don't know anything else about healing brain injury, there are two non-negotiables: sleep and nutrition. Those are for another workshop. The next area to focus on in a brain injury is looking at the foundation of your home, and that foundation is the brainstem. If there is disruption in the brainstem, you're not going to be able to rebuild your home. So breath work is important. Cranial nerve stimulation is important. Vagus nerve stimulation is important. Assessing primitive reflexes. Those are all really important to create that foundation for better brain development. Okay. So step two, this will be the next workshop after those other workshops. But if we're looking at building the house, the next step for me is looking at the balance centers. So I view the balance centers as the framework for the house, and they are commonly disrupted in a brain injury. Two key areas of the balance centers are the cerebellum and the vestibular system. I've come across a couple of numbers on this, but almost every single patient, I know no brain injury is the same, but almost every single patient that I've worked with has some sort of complaint of changes in their balance or dizziness or disequilibrium. And one paper, I have the reference down at the bottom there, showed that 40 to 60% of non-hospitalized patients, they suffered from dizziness and disequilibrium following head trauma. And I believe the reason for that to be those little neurons I showed you, the shearing torsional changes or twisting changes in the neurons, those happen along long tracks, long white matter tracks. So there's basically a miscommunication between our balance centers and our brain. And our balance centers, they sit either inside the brainstem. The vestibular nuclei are in the lower portion of our brainstem. So that goes back to step one. But also right behind the outpouching of our brainstem is the little brain. It's the cerebellum. It's a very neuron-rich area of the nervous system, and it's heavily impacted by a brain injury. You may have seen, if you've ever seen like a video of someone getting pulled over for suspected drunk driving, every single test that a police officer is doing is a cerebellar test, because the cerebellum is so rich in neurons. It's the first area impacted, one of the first areas impacted by alcohol. Alcohol is a suppressant and a depressant in the nervous system, and it shuts down function of the cerebellum. So they check your balance, they check your eye movements, they check your ability to do coordinated movements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1, things like that. So it's commonly involved in a brain injury, and if you have not been prescribed different types of exercises to stimulate the cerebellum, to stimulate the vestibular system, then that could be hindering further brain potential down the road. This is from, I'm the president of an organization for neurorehabilitation. It's called IAFNR. And we've worked closely with doctors from an organization called NORA. They are neuro-optometrists, I believe. They're basically eye doctors that really focus on brain function, and they're amazing. They have great information. So this is their website at the bottom. I highly recommend checking them out if you've never heard of them. There are NORA docs all over the US. I'm not sure about outside the US, but these I learned a lot from some of my seminars with the NORA practitioners. But anyways, there's a statistic on the website that shows that studies show that 90% of all TBI patients suffer from visual dysfunctions, such as but not limited to blurred vision. That's a very common one I hear in the clinic. Sensitivity to light, that's also very common. Difficulty with reading, headaches with a visual task. So visual stimulation, it's too powerful for the brain to appreciate, and that can cause headaches. A reduction or loss of visual field. So that could be a little bit more severe for, especially in a stroke. A lot of patients with stroke, if it's on one side of the brain, they'll have what's called like a homonymous hemianopsia, where they can only see outside of one part of their visual field. And then difficulty with eye movements. This makes sense to me because just looking at the cerebellum, the vestibular system, and talking about those changes in the neurons, what I believe happens is there's an alter in coordination of movement in these eye movements. So the signals that are supposed to go from the nervous system to the cerebellum, to the vestibular system, to the eyes, it all gets skewed. So eyes aren't moving in sync with each other because eye movements are muscle movements. They're just like, they're more sophisticated, but it's just like doing like a bicep movement. Some are reflexive, some are what's called volitional, which means you do it under your own control. But difficulties with eye movements is an extremely important area to look at in a brain injury. So if you have any of these symptoms and you've never had not just your eyes checked, because it's not, some days a patient will say, like, I went to the eye doctor and they said everything's fine with my eyes. And then, my response to that is, well, that's because it's not, in a brain injury, it's not a hardware problem all the time. It could be a software problem, right? Your software got downgraded in the brain injury, and now we have to figure out ways to upgrade that software. Then you do that through specific eye exercises and eye movements. So that's step 2, and I'll go into that deeper. But if you've never looked into some of these key neurorehabilitation strategies when you're rebuilding your nervous system after brain injury, putting up the framework of the house, you have to look at your balance. So balance should be assessed. Vestibular exercises, which are like balance exercises or cerebellar exercises, those should be prescribed specific for the patient, along with eye exercises, and then exercises that incorporate coordination. Because when you do coordinated exercises, you're stimulating your cerebellum, and your cerebellum has tons of pathways that talk to other areas of the brain, and it really helps create that framework for continued brain rehabilitation. So that's step 2, the balance centers. Okay, step 3. I hope this is making sense to everybody. This is the way that I see brain injuries in my head. So step 3 is to assess and rehabilitate the sensory brain. I don't know if I heard this somewhere, but I say it to all of our patients, your brain is a huge sensory sponge, and it loves sensory input. But in a brain injury, sometimes that sensory input can become overwhelming. The reason for that is because there could be dysfunction in the foundation, in the brainstem, right? You're in a sympathetic versus parasympathetic state. Your breath work is totally off. You're just in fight or flight mode. Your balance is off, right? Your world's spinning, or there's disequilibrium. You can't see well because of disconjugate eye movements. And so if the sensory sponge, the sensory area of the brain, is overwhelming, you have to slowly start to implement activities to stimulate that part of the brain. And just again, going back to the reason for this is because the way the brain develops is from the bottom up, brainstem, cerebellum, back to front, occipital, temporal, parietal, frontal lobe. So in order to have influence on the front part of the brain and to help the front part of the brain heal, it sometimes needs good sensory input. A brain that can feel better can move better, right? Feeling is the back part of our brain, movement is the front part of our brain. So assessing and rehabilitating the sensory brain are important. Again, this is another workshop that I'm going to do following up from the workshop before this, because I think it's really important to break these down with more specificity. Just can't do it in an hour. So, okay. Now, what happens in a brain injury? I've read some numbers on this, and some of the numbers are different, but approximately, and this is just something I read in the research, there can be upwards of a 50% reduction in cerebral blood flow following a brain injury. And as we know, our plumbing system, blood flow brings oxygen and nutrition to the cells. And our brain is a gravity dependent organ, which means that it relies on good heart pumping, good blood pressure, adequate blood supply in order to get nutrition and then get rid of toxins. So reduced cerebral blood flow signifies one of the most lasting markers of concussion in animal models of TBI. While cerebral blood flow has been shown to be decreased immediately after injury in an animal model, and decreased regional cerebral blood flow persisted after injury. So we have to get better brain blood flow to the area that's been affected. I will sometimes do this in conjunction with brainstem stimulation or balance stimulation, depending on where the patient's at in their rehabilitation journey. But this is really important. You've got to figure out ways to get blood flow to the sensory brain. A brain that feels better can move better, and it can just be better overall. And also, this is a whole other topic, but chronic pain pathways. You have this altered, so you can feel, but it's an altered sense of perception, right? So like a light wind affects like in trigeminal neuralgia, affects the nervous system in a harmful way when it shouldn't. That should actually feel pretty good. So you have to really work on the sensory area of the brain. And I do that by bringing blood flow to the brain. And I do that through different exercises. So in our clinic, we use photobiomodulation, lasers. There's other ways to do this. I really enjoy reading the research on photobiomodulation, because in concussion, there's so many patient stories, but I have this one young guy. He was such an intelligent guy. He played football, but he's just such a smart guy. I think I spelled inflammatory wrong. I'm not sure. I always get it. Anyways, first time I saw him, he couldn't even put a hat on his head because his head hurt so bad. The reason for that was he was hit head on in football. I think it was a head-to-head contact. He was like a punter, and someone just blindly bashed his head in. And of course, he had all the brain scans done. Everything looked normal. You're fine. But it wasn't a hardware problem. It was a software problem. And he had chronic pain. And it was just like a reverberating pain on his head. He couldn't even wear a hat. But this is a guy who's going for his master's. He was a teacher's assistant, just such a smart guy. And he could not tolerate a lot of sensory stimulation. And that's not uncommon for patients, because all the messages and signals are scrambled, and it's way too much information for the brain. So we had to start out with one of the most non-invasive methods to just try to stimulate the brain. And what that was we worked on breath work, right? Trying to shift the nervous system from more of a sympathetic to a parasympathetic state. But then we also worked on blood flow and reducing the energy crisis in the nervous system and in the brain. So transcranial photobiomodulation, the light can pass through the skull. There's evidence that shows that it passes through the skull. It can do a lot of things for the nervous system. I'm not saying it does everything, but it's a great non-invasive method if you're already doing you've already worked on your sleep. Your sleep is awesome. My nutrition is amazing. I've done everything for nutrition. I do vagus nerve stimulation 3 times a day. I do all these things, but like I still have this chronic pain in my head. That's when you have to start implementing and focusing on other areas and looking for something non-invasive like photobiomodulation. So it can do a lot of things like increase nerve growth factors and BDNF. It can help improve synaptogenesis. It can help with increased angiogenesis. So that means creating new vascular networks to help bring nutrition and oxygen to the system. It has an anti-inflammatory effect, which inflammation is not always bad, but if it goes on for a long period of time and becomes unregulated, that's when it becomes a problem. It can reduce apoptosis, which is cellular death, and reduce neuronic cytotoxicity, right? So like change that firing of the cells so that they're not just constantly firing to any stimulus that comes by. They wait for the appropriate response and then they fire. So it's just a really neat application, and you can start changing the sensory brain by using photobiomodulation amongst other tools. I think that's all I had to say about that. So some of the key neurorehabilitation strategies for the sensory brain: the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe. I use auditory stimulation. I have a couple of devices that I love. I actually love, if you've never seen it, I love the brain tap from Dr. Stephen. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a total blank here. I was about to say Stephen Porges. I have no idea I was going to say that. Oh my gosh, I see him in my head. I feel like a big. Anyways, the brain tap. It's awesome. Patrick Porter, Dr. Patrick Porter, and I think his father created the brain tap. I use that for auditory and visual stimulation. I use it for myself because you'll see in the next slide, I talk about mindfulness. I'm not a good meditator. I don't necessarily sit in silence very well, but he uses binaural beats, guided meditation, and visual stimulation to help heal the brain. And I think it's a pretty awesome tool. There's other ways to do it, but sound is such an impactful stimulus to the brain. Music therapy, amazing for the healing brain. Visual stimulation. So I'll go into further detail in this workshop, but not sitting inside all day, not sitting under junk light all day, getting outside, getting in nature, changing your surrounding environment is extremely important for your brain. In a stroke, if someone has what I mentioned earlier, that hemi-neglect or that lack of visual field, making sure that they have visual stimulation coming into the brain on the side that they can't necessarily see well, because that will help stimulate the brain and change the brain. Vibration stimulation to help stimulate the sensory brain, electrical stimulation, and then, like I mentioned, photobiomodulation. Okay, the last step, and then I'm going to leave you guys with a couple of tools and things to work on. So step 4, assess and rehabilitate the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex. This is the roof of the house. This is the way I see it in brain rehabilitation. Your brain, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that makes you who you are. And it is very common to be injured in a brain injury, even if it wasn't directly physically injured. The best description or example I can give you of direct physical injury was a guy by the name of Phineas Gage. Legend has it, I never met this person, it was a long time ago, but he was a nice, humble, hard worker. All of a sudden, a railroad spike went through the front part of his brain, and this was a long time ago, so the fact that he even survived that was profound. But what happened was Phineas changed. His personality completely changed, and he changed from a nice, I think he was like a family guy, hard worker, to a degenerate, alcoholic gambler. And what neuroscience tells us is that his prefrontal cortex just totally went offline. He lost that ability for executive function because of the physical injury to his brain. And that's pretty profound when you're learning about the brain, because that tells us that some anatomical areas are extremely important for their roles and their jobs. And this is probably the most important area, in my opinion, because it makes you who you are. And you may not feel like the person that you once were with a brain injury. And that could be because the prefrontal cortex just got offline. So the goal is to rehabilitate that area through different types of physical stimulation and mental stimulation. But I just don't think you can get the most out of that area of the brain if you have other areas that have not been addressed. And that's just based on our normal neurotypical development. So before you put the roof on the house, you've got to make sure that you have a solid foundation. All of the framework is good. The structure is strong. All the walls are sound, right? And then the roof goes on. So in my opinion, if the patient is able and physically capable of doing some sort of physical exercise, there is no substitute for physical exercise when you're recovering from brain injury. When I spoke about that NFL player who was told to just go sit in a dark room for like going on 3 weeks, I was just blown away. I didn't even know that much about brain injuries, but from what I knew at that time, I told him, I was like, just don't feel like that's the best option for you, especially because you are extremely physically capable of engaging in some sort of physical activity. So I got him set up with someone that I knew near him, and then he did some of this stuff and he was able to play again. So very similar mechanisms that occur to photobiomodulation when you perform physical exercise. One of the most that this paper down here talked about was attenuated secondary injury damage, because not only could you have that primary physical injury, but the secondary injury, so maybe that neurochemical cascade that occurs of inflammation, oxidative stress, that repetitive cycle, that can create secondary damage to the neurons and reduce the chances for neuroplasticity. But exercise can attenuate that and hopefully reverse it. So the prefrontal cortex is a workshop in and of its own. But if you haven't looked into any of this stuff, I think it's important. Mindfulness training. I use the brain tap device. I really like it. I love the visual lights, if you can tolerate that. And I love the guided meditations. In the office, we also use a product called Mendi. It's a very affordable product that helps with prefrontal cortex stimulation. TCDS, transcutaneous direct stimulation, transcranial direct stimulation. We use a device called the Fisher-Wallace device. The Fisher-Wallace is an electrical device FDA cleared for depression and anxiety. They just stopped selling their first model, and they're coming out with a new model called the Oak. But I also think that it is an affordable device that can help stimulate the prefrontal cortex. We use it in the clinic. I use it on myself. I really like it because this time of year, just admittedly, I typically get SAD, seasonal affective disorder. I tell all my friends I'm solar powered. I do best like outside in the sun. My brain just feels better. My mind feels better. My body feels better. If I don't get some sort of natural sunlight, I just don't feel like I'm my best self. So this helps with that, the TCDS, but also like finding the time in these shorter days in the winter to get outside. And then I also use red light panels and the lasers. But mindfulness training, TCDS, physical exercise, there's no substitute for this free tool if you can do it. And I know some people will say, well, I can't tolerate this. That's okay. Like, there is a starting point, even if it's that couch potato brain getting up and going for a 3-minute walk. If you're removing yourself from an environment where your brain likes to relax and go outside and get physical exercise, even if it's a 3 to 5 minute walk, you're going to start to slowly feel the changes. And then you're going to start to want to go out if you can walk. If you're in a wheelchair, just getting outside and doing some pushes. Anything to get the body moving, because when the body moves, the brain can start to groove. And it's really, really important. Our brains developed because of physical stimulation, sensory input, and physical movement. They do not develop from sedentary lifestyle. They actually begin to regress. Neurons prune, things get shut down. It's all prime real estate in the brain. So if you don't use it, you truly lose it. So you have to figure out a way to do physical exercise. I probably should have put that as like a non-negotiable. But, you know, a lot of times people will say, I can't do anything. I feel horrible. Well, we have to find something that you could do where you don't feel horrible. Like I had one patient, they just don't like walking, but they love to swim. Awesome. Swimming is a great exercise for cardiovascular, a little bit of muscle activation, range of motion of your limbs. It is really good for primitive reflex rehabilitation because you're stimulating your vestibular system, you're getting sensory on your body when you swim. So there has to be something. Expressive writing. I don't mean to take up a lot of people's time, and if you have to go, that's totally cool. But I was introduced in my nurse practitioner rotations to a spine surgeon by the name of David Hanscom. Him and I have done a couple of interviews on Brain Chat before. But he is a spinal surgeon who worked his way out of spine surgery by using the principles of neuroplasticity. So he's very open about this. He used expressive writing because he himself had pretty debilitating anxiety and I believe depression at one point in his life. And no matter how much he saw a psychiatrist or a psychologist, it just wasn't really helping him. But he started to use expressive writing, which is basically just writing down your thoughts, taking, you know, spending 5 to 10 minutes a day just writing down whatever thoughts come to mind, because thoughts are just thoughts. But when you put them to paper, it kind of changes your relationship to the thoughts. So doing expressive writing is a great tool to help reduce pain and things of that nature. I'll go into more detail about it, but he's really cool. He wrote a book called Back in Control. He has a website called Back in Control for anyone that suffers from chronic pain. He's a spine surgeon, but I think the principles of his work are based around neuroplasticity, and then photobiomodulation. So it's pretty much the gist of this introduction to brain injury basics. But some of the key takeaways are if the person's capable, and if you've never done this before, we're going to do this at the end. Conscious control of breathing is super important. You have to shift the nervous system away from fight or flight and shift it into parasympathetic rest and digest. If you don't, it's hard to oxygenate your system. You're retaining CO2. You're promoting more oxidative stress, more inflammation, more excitotoxicity. And then you're stuck in a fight or flight mode. You have more skeletal muscle contraction. You start to get shoulder pain, trap pain, neck pain, all because of breath, right? And the reason for that is we'll typically shift into fight or flight after the brain injury and might stay there. So if you've never worked on breath work, that's really important. Rest and sleep, not isolation. So deep rest, deep sleep, not isolating yourself. On another note, one way to stimulate the vagus nerve, this is based on the principles of the polyvagal theory by Dr. Stephen Porges, is social engagement. So if you're on different chat groups, that's great. But even in person, being able to spend time with loving people that you love, creating a positive social environment is so important for your vagus nerve. Nutrition creates optimal an optimal internal environment. If you're not eating right, if you're not feeding your system, well, it's going to be hard to build neuroplasticity. So sleep, nutrition, and brainstem stimulation help build back our barriers, and they help set the foundation for better brain ability. So that's where I think everyone needs to start. We've got to start with some of those non-negotiables and start with the brainstem stimulation. That will be the next chat. So before we go, pause that. Okay, this is a great website. It's a free focused conscious breathing website. It helps guide you through the breath. Exhaler.com. So you can visit that and it'll just pop up like this and it'll say ready, set, go, and you'll start breathing. But this is a paced breathing exercise that slows down your breathing to about 5 to 6 breaths per minute. Now, the goal with this is to help shift your nervous system into a more parasympathetic state. So I wanted to try it with everybody if you're willing. I believe I edited this video to a minute long, but the goal with this is to try to work your way up to doing this exercise for like 7 to 10 minutes a day, once or twice a day. For some people, it might be hard. So using this on the computer screen could help you, but if you can do it by yourself, that's even better, like sitting outside, fresh air, fresh sunlight. And then what I do with my inhales and exhales is I inhale through my nose to stimulate that nitric oxide production to help oxygenate the system. And then I exhale with a hum. So let's do it, even though I can't hear you guys, but we'll put this on. And here's what I'll say about breathing. If you do a breathing exercise and you feel a difference afterwards, so if you feel like you've shifted into more of a parasympathetic state, if you feel more relaxed, then your nervous system needs this. Most of the time throughout the day, we're just constantly interrupted with daily stressors or daily thoughts that set off the stress response. So taking time out of your day to do this on a daily basis, it helps build neuroplasticity in these pathways. All right, let's do it. 2, 1, inhale. And do a sigh if you can. I just don't want to make a lot of noise. I'm going to talk to you guys while you're doing this. So a couple of key things with breathing. You do not want to do, the goal is to do more of a diaphragmatic breath. I know people probably know this, but even if you do know this, you never step in the same river twice, right? You're a different person than you were a few weeks or months ago. So put one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest. And when you do your deep inhale through your nose, you want to feel your belly go out. You don't want to feel your chest go out. And then you should feel your belly come in as you exhale. And when you do diaphragmatic breathing, you're really stimulating those parasympathetic pathways. So it's a good exercise to do. So that's a free website. I recommend checking that out. If you've never heard of Kevin Ballister before, he's become a friend of mine. He lives in Florida. He has a pretty remarkable brain injury recovery story. I've done a couple of interviews with him on my Brain Chat page, but he wrote a book and it's called How to Feed a Brain. He had a traumatic brain injury in 2011, a severe diffuse axonal injury, and now he's writing books, but he's helping people and helping guide people on what you should really feed your body to help feed your brain. And when he first wrote his book, I didn't know what to think before I read it. And then I was blown away by the information. It's really great information. It's evidence-based. And I think it's really important because, if let's say you're in the hospital and you have a loved one and, you probably know this, but like most of the food is just bad. It's junk food. It's inflammatory foods. It's not setting the stage for better brain ability and better brain healing. So that's what he talks about in this book. He has a website, just a really good resource for anyone that suffered from a brain injury that maybe needs more guidance on nutrition or where to get started with nutrition, because again, it's a non-negotiable. So I'll talk more about this in the next workshop. Another thing that's important, just I'll mention this before I wrap this up. If you have a loved one or if they're on a feeding tube, he gives you ideas for that as well, because a lot of, formulas, a lot of them can be inflammatory. So it's good information. Okay, that's pretty much it. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for signing up for this, spending your lunch with me. The next workshop, thank you for making sure that my slides showed up. Next workshop will be diving deep into sleep and nutrition for brain injury. Would love for you to attend. I'm going to shoot to do that like the first or second week of January. Try to keep these rolling on a monthly basis. And then if you want any more information from me, you can... I'm mostly checking my Instagram page. It's at Dr. Ryan Siedemark. Long story about that. It was Brain Chat, but I got hacked. I think it was a guy in Turkey or a person in Turkey totally hacked my Brain Chat account, and Instagram did nothing to help me. Like I was like, hey, this is legit. Like I have a lot of organic followers. This is my passion project. I gave him my whole sob story and never heard back from him. So that's my new Instagram page. If you're on there, I post the same things I do on there as I do on Brain Chat. They're linked. We work with a company that sells the laser. If you're interested in learning more about laser therapy or electrical stimulation with a device that we use in the clinic called the StimPod. And then anyone that is interested in more information from a patient perspective and doing neurorehabilitation, I do discovery calls. So we typically set up like a free 20-minute virtual call on certain days and times. Email our clinic, our front desk. Her name is Jasmine. She's awesome.
shoot her an email. And yeah, I'd love to, meet you in person. So let me